If you hated hearing that, I had to read it. I know, right? So let me just say, first of all, though, that I know you're disappointed. I know you're disappointed because before you came to church this morning, you probably checked the Revised Common Lectionary that you have at home and to see what the readings were going to be for today, and that's not them. No. It's a little bit like a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about Star Trek, isn't it? Okay. So the Common Lectionary, and then later the Revised Common Lectionary, is the thing that tells us what scripture readings we use on a Sunday morning. It's a 3-year cycle that has 4 readings, minimum of 4 readings for each occasion, right? And so you get something from Hebrew scripture, a psalm, one of the epistles, that's the letters that are at the towards the end of the Christian scripture, and a reading from one of the Gospels. There's slight variation of that, but that's the regular setup. So there's 4 pieces each week. We almost never use all 4. Lots of traditions do, but we tend to focus on 1 or 2 or maybe 3 if they're all connected, right? If there's an obvious connection. But the thing about the Revised Common Lectionary is there's some really good things about it. One is that a lot of mainline traditions in the Christian church use it. And that's kind of the point, is that regardless of what tradition or how we come to God, each week we are using essentially the same scripture. We're using the same word, interpreting it differently, of course, but we're using the same word, which is kind of a unifying thing, which is great, and it makes you feel good. That being said, the thing about the Revised Common Lectionary is it's a 3-year cycle of readings. In a 3-year cycle of readings, one Sunday a week, you can't possibly read the Bible. So if you're somebody who would like to read through the whole Bible, it takes longer than that. And so what they did was they got together and decided on the sort of key things that you needed to know, key themes in Scripture, and what those Scripture passages would be, so that you would know the key themes in Scripture without having to read the whole Bible, as long as you went to church every week. The thing about that is, first of all, that's not really encouraging you to read the whole thing. And you should. It's a great idea, though, because it reinforces the basic themes of the church. You see where that's not a good idea suddenly, don't you? It's not necessarily reinforcing the themes of Scripture. It's reinforcing the themes of Scripture that the church thinks you need to know. Which is why you're hearing those 2 passages of Scripture today from me. They're actually from last week. But last week I was honestly wanted to talk about this last week because it was the right Sunday and all, but there was also a really great idea, a great theme in the gospel reading, and I could tie the 2 things together. I really could, but it would take 45 minutes, and nobody wants that. So, here's the thing. You heard a passage from the Song of Solomon, or it's also known as the Song of Songs in Hebrew Scripture. And not everyone includes that, by the way, in their Bibles. Our tradition does. And that is the only time in the 3-year cycle of the Revised Common Lectionary you will hear a passage of Scripture from the Song of Songs. The only time and the only piece. You won't hear anything else. On the other hand, every single week you get something from one of the epistles. Every week. What does that tell you? The epistles are more important, obviously. Are they? A few weeks ago, I was talking about how the Bible is kind of like a library, right? It's not a book, it's a library. It has different sections, and there's different things in the library in those sections, and which is one of the reasons why it's very easy to find something in the Bible that you can find contradicted somewhere else in the Bible. The Song of Solomon is, how should I put this? It's the erotica section. It's not quite 50 Shades of Grey, but it's, for its day, was super racy. It's love poems, basically, is what it is. You should read it. I probably should have said that before I said it's the erotica section, but you should read it. You should very definitely read it. It doesn't really have the same flow of story because it's not a story that other books in the Bible do. I mean, it's a collection of poems, love poems. And it's called Songs of Solomon, or Song of Solomon, by the way, not necessarily because it was written by Solomon, but because Solomon is named in it. We're not really sure who wrote it. In fact, it starts out sounding very much like it was written by the guy, and then about partway through you realize it was actually written by the woman, and it's very definitely worth reading, though. Very definitely worth reading. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. The epistles, on the other hand, the letters that are in Christian scripture, are more the DIY self-help section. Right? They're also not story. They're more about responding to issues in the earliest days of the church, and they're more about more practical ways that you can address issues that come up. In fact, my usual go-to example is Paul's letter to the Corinthians, because it's pretty obvious when you read Paul's letters to the Corinthians that he's responding to something going on there. This is often the case in the others, or it's instructional, or he's letting people know something important they need to know because he's headed their way, which is Romans, by the way. The point of the letter to the Romans was that he's headed that way because he wants to actually expand his mission into Spain, and so he's hoping to get more support from the community in Rome. As it happens, he does get to Rome after he gets arrested, and so it doesn't exactly work out that way for him, but that's really what this letter is about. And you probably notice a little bit of a contrast between the two. The Song of Songs, I prefer Song of Songs rather than Song of Solomon, first of all, just because Solomon's named doesn't mean it's about him or by him, but also in Hebrew scripture, they tend to refer to it as Song of Songs because that's Bible code for this is the most, bestest, importantest thing you'll ever read, right? It's like King of Kings or Holy of Holies, right? So they got included because it's important stuff. Why? They're basically just love poems. Well, Hebrew scripture, Jews tend to interpret it as being about the relationship between God and Israel. Christians tend to interpret the Song of Solomon as being about the relationship between the Christ and the church, which is fine. That's great. It's an interpretation. Another interpretation is that these are love poems between someone who clearly loves the other fully. Not just, I love your spirit, but I love the rest of you. Let's just go with the rest of you. It's about connecting with somebody physically as well as emotionally, as well as spiritually. It's about love. That's what they're about. That's why you should read it. That's also probably why the church doesn't want you to necessarily. Because unless you're interpreting it in the very spiritual way that they'd like you to, you are reinforcing Paul's point, which is your flesh is sinful. So let's get to Paul. That is a theme in Paul, isn't it? It is a theme. Paul is very much the ascetic kind of person, right? It's not just you want just anything that's physical. No, that's bad. He makes it pretty clear in that passage, which sounds like you need to read it 6 or 7 times because there's a lot of this and that and back and forth thing. But essentially what he's saying is your flesh is sinful, inherently sinful. And you want to, in fact, there's a battle between the spirit and the flesh. Just to be clear, though, when Paul says flesh, he may not necessarily mean just your physical body. That may be a more inclusive, all of humanity-ish kind of thing. In fact, the very fact that you're human means that you're inherently sinful. I just have real trouble saying it because I think he's wrong. I'm sorry, don't throw anything, but I think Paul's wrong. At the very least, in the manner in which he expresses it, I want desperately to say we're wrong in the way we interpret it, but just the way he says it, that you are human makes you inherently sinful. And bear in mind that Paul didn't have the concept of original sin in his head. We made that up a few centuries later. Yeah, we made that up a few centuries later. But here's Paul saying the flesh is inherently sinful, whether he means your actual physical body or whether he means humanity as a thing, as a being, you as a being, a human being. Here's Paul saying the flesh is inherently sinful in contrast to the spirit, which is with God. One of the arguments for that, of course, is that that's why you have laws in Hebrew Scripture. Remember that Paul was a Jew. That's why you have the law, is because that helps to connect you with God, your spirit with God, while holding your physical, your fleshy being at bay. The thing is, Jesus isn't an either-or kind of character. Jesus is an and character. And I think one of the points that Jesus tries to make is about wholeness of body, mind, and spirit. It's not a battle between the flesh and the spirit. The battle is understanding that it's not a contrast at all. It's an and. They work together. They have to. This is another reason why you should read the Song of Songs. It is because clearly the love that is being expressed there isn't just physical. Some of it very much is. But it isn't just physical. It's clearly an expression of love that has a very, very strong physical component, but it's clearly an expression of love. Somewhere along the line, I think either Paul or we, in our understanding of Paul, started to interpret this as meaning you are inherently bad. Well, first of all, original sin, but your physical body is inherently bad. It's sinful. In fact, that's where sin resides, not in your spirit, but in your body, in your flesh. But does it? First of all, I think we're inherently good, and not just spiritually. I think when we say things like created in the image of God, it makes it very easy to go, well, we're just talking about the spirit, because if you start talking about the body, the flesh, the body, or the earthly creation of things, then you're getting into that thing about where you're trying to anthropomorphize God, right? Where you're trying to make God look like us and not us look like God, because God very definitely wouldn't look like this, right? Because God's spirit. Okay, except then what's the point of Jesus? What's the point of describing Jesus as a word made flesh? What's the point of trying to understand Jesus' life as being solely spiritual in nature and helping us spiritually, when in fact the point of it is the word made flesh? Jesus experiencing the Spirit, experiencing this. I'm not for a moment suggesting that it isn't difficult. I'm not for the moment suggesting that we aren't attracted to things we probably shouldn't be. I'm not suggesting that we don't have experiences in our life and feel things that lead us into what the church would categorize as sin. However, I don't think you can separate those two things out. We are a wholeness of being. We are body, mind, and spirit together. Those things don't fight each other. They work together. Let me say that differently. We often act like those things fight with each other, and it's a battle. What if they didn't? What if we acted like those things belonged together, were meant to be together, were meant to inform and be part of each other, working together? instead of saying wholeness of spirit was important, we said wholeness of whole is important. However that might appear. Because that's the other thing we do with Paul. Thank you very much for this, Paul. We tend to take what Paul says, and then we turn it with our moral judging and our judgment of others, so we turn it into something else. We turn it into a very easy way for us to judge others. Either because of how they look, because you look sinful, I'm not looking at anyone in particular, or because if you behave a certain way that I don't agree with, I can judge you, and therefore you're sinful. That's not our job, by the way. Our job isn't to judge others. And if we are followers of Jesus, I honestly don't get where did we get the we should judge others thing from? Because if you follow Jesus, Jesus clearly makes the point that it's not your job to judge other people. It's your job to love them. The wholeness of them, not just their behavior, not just their appearance, not just their spirit, not just their mind. You're supposed to love the wholeness of them. Wouldn't it be different if instead of separating these things out as if they could exist by themselves, we wondered how they could work together? Not against each other, but together. What if we thought about wholeness of being rather than simply wholeness of spirit? What if we thought about wholeness of being rather than simply wholeness of body? What if we stopped judging people on the basis not only of their appearance but their ability? Because that's simply part of the wholeness that they are, and loved them for that. See, instead of thinking that those things are separate, if we saw them working together, the possibility of them working together, then we'd see how connected they are. It always amazes me that you read this and all this stuff in Romans and elsewhere too. Paul says all this stuff that leads you to believe that the spirit and the flesh are fighting each other somehow. There's a battle going on there and the spirit needs to win. And that's the same guy who wrote about how we are a body and all of the members are important. The only thing that I can think is that Paul spent a lot of time thinking about where we were going rather than where we are. Because clearly Paul sees where we're going as being the place of spirit. And that's what we want to achieve. But our goal in life isn't to get there. Our goal in life is to be here. Here, where there is flesh and life in the body and in creation and in the mind, in this wholeness, and with each other in that wholeness. I think we need to revisit what we're reading a little bit. I think we need to read more of things like the Song of Songs, more of the Psalms, and more of the parts of the gospel where Jesus is reminding us constantly of that wholeness of body and spirit. That those things not only belong together, that this is the creation in which we live. And that our goal is to live and love in this creation. Not simply with the aim of where we're going next, but with the aim of making sure that this feels like where we think we're going next. Why else would Jesus talk about how heaven is near Heaven is here. That's how it is here. Not because we divest ourselves of everything but the Spirit and live only in the Spirit in this existence, which, by the way, is impossible, but that we live in the context in which we are, which we have our being, which is body, mind, and spirit.